Hello and welcome to Inside Exercise. Today I'm bringing to you Professor Abbie Smith-Ryan from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. We have a really, I think, important discussion about women in science and also female exercise physiology. The women in science part was, really brought to my attention. When I started the podcast, several people pointed out, and I was already aware that the first six people I had on were males, and it's like, where the women? So it was really good to try and think about, all the different factors that are affecting women in science, and indeed how that may, end up affecting my little podcast here. So we discussed a lot of things such as, obvious things we tend to think about that, women tend to spend more time with childcare and housework at home, even if they have a supportive partner, but also other things such as invisible labor, the effect that the pandemic has had, especially on women, things that men don't have to think about, such as, their appearance. If you're ambitious with a male, that's great. You're showing leadership. If you're a female, possibly people might think you're being bossy or something. Our females tend to do more service work. And then we discussed, possible ways to try and redress this imbalance. Abbie was really great, really pleasant person to deal with. She didn't look at me as like a middle-aged white dinosaur, which I felt like sometimes. It was a really pleasant chat. And then we switched to Abbie's main research focus, which is female exercise physiology. We talked about sex differences and, the fact that often you're not wanting to necessarily look at sex differences, but just wanting to look at female exercise physiology per se. The importance of considering female participants carefully in terms of selection criteria, but also trying to reduce barriers to participation. And we compared and contrasted exercise and nutrition recommendations for males and females. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Abbie, how are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you this evening?
It's this evening for me and this morning for you. Okay. So today we're going to talk about women in science, and if we have time, we'll talk about, female exercise physiology, which you've done a lot of work on. But first of all, I was just wondering, how did you even get into the field? How did you start as an academic?
Yeah, well, and first, let me say thanks for having me on and reaching out amongst all your experts. I don't feel quite qualified to be here, but we're going to soak up the time. And so I think I fell in love with research when I was much younger, actually in college and university, as you all call it. I was a collegiate runner and had many injuries, and really began to understand it wasn't just about the training, it was also about the nutrition. And I really loved this idea that you could ask a question and answer it. And so from there, I personally went straight from college or university to my master's, to my PhD, and then directly into a tenure track faculty job, which is not always now in our field. Postdocs are a little bit more common. When I came out, they weren't quite as common, but our field is adapting. And so here I am.
Well, I think you've done very well. I think you've worked out how to do the tenure track. You just became a professor, I saw.
I did, yes.
Yes. So actually, we're going to talk about women in science. So you're a success story, but we're going to talk about all the different sort of challenges. And I have to say, when I reached out to you, we talked about this. I hadn't really thought through it all, to be honest. And it has been a thing though, because I don't know if you saw, but when I first started the podcast, the first three were males. And then I sent a tweet out saying the next three, and they happen to be males as well. And then someone said, where are all the females? Is there no females in exercise science? And, even though I did actually have a few lined up that the person hadn't seen, it's true. I've had, trouble lining up females, and it's looking like, the first 12 podcasts will be like 2, now you, 3 females. So, it's made me think, and, I really do want to sort of balance things up. And, you've had some thoughts about that. So what do you, actually, before we go too far, I wanted to clarify that, we're talking about, women in science. We're
talking about biological females.
Yeah, exactly. But that's more later on though with the,
yeah. Well, when you say women, but I think the other thing is that I feel like your response, you can tell that you've clearly tried to get a mix and balance of men and women, but you've also recognized that there's a whole lot more men that are full professors that have made a large scientific impact, which I think is a really important point. And kudos to you for saying like, hey, let's talk about maybe why. So I mean, I think that is awesome.
Yeah, well, it has been a bit of an old boys club so far, but you know, it would be great to try and balance this up. But you know, there are probably, you know, it is a situation where if you look at the who's who of exercise science, which is what I'm trying to get on here, they do tend to be, on average, white males, you know, my age.
Mm-hmm.
So,
well, I mean, I think that's good to recognize, which you have. There's also some incredible women, and the way I look at it is all these men that you have had, they've impacted my career, and I've learned a lot from them, and that we should embrace that. At the same time, can we ask the question of how do we get more women? Where are the women? Maybe why aren't there more? And so I think that's great that we're having that conversation.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think you know, straight up, I'm going to say I hadn't really thought through it all. Some of the things I had, you know, I sent an email to you were, you know, obviously tending to be more likely to be doing like housework and home duties, looking after kids and things like that, you know, which is true. And I guess we'll get to the fact that it's probably become even more so during the pandemic, and you know, and what a disaster that can be for females going forward. But you know, why don't we just elaborate on that a bit more, and some of the things that you brought up, which I hadn't actually thought of.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciated your email because it really showed, like, often we're not having these conversations, and so I think the things that you mentioned, like why aren't women either in a higher level, or why aren't they coming on the podcast? And yeah, I'm sure housework and home life, which women do tend to participate more in, that's part of it. But I think it allowed us to, and allows us to have this conversation of what are the other things that maybe don't come to mind. And there are a lot of systemic and institutional things in academia, in my opinion, that do make it harder for women, which I think there are more women coming to the top, but it's slower, and it is more challenging. And so, I mean, those are some of the things I threw out, like just at work, how we're wired, some of our own things as women. Happy to chat through that.
Yeah. Well, I saw that they were saying, you know, that obviously in science, there is more males, and actually the higher you go up, the more and more males there are. So that's, you know, that's not good.
Well, yeah, and I mean, this is, again, I like to say this is my opinion and experience, and I do know that some of it is not just me alone, you know, based on conversations with other women. But I think our field and academia really breeds this. It's competitive. It breeds this, like, well, if you get a grant, then I can't get the grant. Where I view it as, okay, well, if you get a grant, that's great. There's still money. Like, my science is slightly different. And I think in the older generation, like the way our field was established, it very much, it's more collaborative now, but it's that mindset of competition, and which breeds insecurities. And so I think women have an insecure, when we take our insecurities, we take them inside, and we have a lot of self-doubt and imposter syndrome, where a lot of times men turn it around and are more, they show their insecurities by being competitive and maybe, you know, not as collaborative or supportive, not in all cases. So I think there's some of that goes through. And so women tend to just trickle out, and men tend to push on in some respect.
Yeah. And, you know, again, just thinking about back at the home, because I'm still sort of stuck at that level, and then we think about at work, having kids, right? So obviously that's the sort of the you know, the cliche that, you know, some people, oh no, woman should be, hopefully we're moving away from that, you know, oh, woman should be in the home looking after the kids. But in reality, that is still what happens, right? You know, on average, right? So obviously you can have different situations. So I read that, you know, after having kids in the United States, you know, 43% of women and 23% of men actually leave their full-time jobs. So, you know, that's a huge figure, and it is affecting the females more.
Well, yeah. And I mean, one of the things I mentioned ahead of time is, you know, like I know as a young female, I didn't see many women having children and still being research active and, you know, continuing to do this position. And I had amazing male mentors, but that wasn't a conversation that I could necessarily have with a male mentor of how do I have kids and continue to be good and to progress. And so I think some of it comes about it not being a taboo subject, because as a woman, it left me with this idea of if I want kids, can I do it? Can I continue to meet the needs that I need or that I have and the, you know, the expectations I have and be a good mom? How does that look? I didn't know what that looked like. There was not a lot of mentors in that capacity. And there weren't men that were having that conversation with me about how it would look. And even, you know, I remember having a miscarriage. That's not something you talked about, but I had to still go to work and pretend like I was fine. And so I think this conversation of recognizing that if you want to have a family, it's part of you. And I mean, before we jumped on here, you told me, you mentioned to a male colleague, like, it's okay to go home. You should be at home with your family. Having the conversation about, okay, yes, work is important and you have to get your work done, but it's also not who you are or your life. Like family is also important. And I think having some of those conversations and having more women in higher roles of how it could look is really important. Sometimes, you know, it's finding someone who you want to be like and emulating some of those aspects. Like, how do you have kids and still juggle grants and papers? I think those are the conversations that are not being had. And even like, it's really hard. But let's talk about why it's hard and how do we make it easier, opposed to just, let's not talk about it at all. You're on leave, you just had a baby, like figure it out, you know?
Well, I mean, seeing as we've got you here and you are doing these things, then, you know, maybe some people that are watching are wondering how you do that. So, you know, you said you have 2 kids, you've got tons of papers, grants, whatever. How do you actually do it? Do you have to work like crazy? Or?
You know, I wouldn't say I do it very well. And I've had a lot of challenges. And so I think to me, it's about making it easier behind me. And, you know, so one thing actually young women ask me now is like, well, what advice do you have? And I say, don't do it like me. I am at this point, I'm burnt out and I'm tired. And I probably did more than I needed to, but nobody said like, I was under this assumption that I did need to do all that. That was kind of the messaging, when turns out, like if you are passionate about what you're doing and you do what you want to do, like there's a place for you. It doesn't necessarily have to be at an R1 institution. Like, so to me, the biggest thing is finding something you really love and putting your time and effort into those priorities. And so, yes, I work a lot of hours. Part of why I went directly through from my PhD to a job, 2 kids, is because I wanted to put in all the hours up front and have the ability to have children. And I'm gonna say back off a little bit, but it changes how you work, you know? And so I put in hours before they go to bed, or, you know, before they wake up and after they go to bed, so that when they are awake and I have them, they are all mine, you know? And so it's just shuffling and figuring out when you work in time management.
Time efficiency, I'm sure.
Yeah, and no one's, you know, like sometimes I do it really poorly. So, and you have to have a support team. Like, you know, I have a great group of students and research team, and my husband's in academia. So just trying to, I don't know. Yeah, I don't have all the answers, but maybe after some few more years, I'll have more, you know, enlightenment.
So one thing I read was how, you know, the pandemic was so bad, and it's affecting probably women again more, because, you know, I know we're going to talk about the factors not just in the home, but, you know, it's true that females on average do more housework, more looking after the kids, etc. And I even read something that said that sometimes now we're getting paternity leave. I don't know if you've got paternity leave in the US, but but it actually said that what tends to happen is when male academics go on paternity leave, they go, oh, this is like a sabbatical, I'm going to get some work done. And females obviously are going to be tending to look after the kid. So, yeah, so just have you thought about, and how did you manage during the pandemic? I'm sure you thought about that, you know, with schools closed or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. There's this term that's come up in the literature called invisible labor. And so the invisible labor is, you know, making sure that there's toilet paper around, like all the little things that men and women are wired differently. And so my brain doesn't shut off. And so I think it's really recognizing that I have this at home to-do list, like make sure my kids' clothes fit and make sure that we have, you know, Cheerios for breakfast. And so there's this mental load at home on top of my work to-do list. And so I think it's really important to recognize like just the mental load of women are different. And with the pandemic, you know, I think it hit everyone, but yes, I think on the residual side effect, there's a lot of data that's showing that there are way fewer women that are publishing. It's very much hit
Yes.
the ability to, you know, publish papers and write grants. And, you know, I think it goes back to that mental load and that, you know, caretaking tasks that we have. Even if you have an incredible significant other, it just men and women are wired differently. And so, yeah, the toll is different.
Sure, I was just going to say, I was sort of smiling a bit while you were talking. You might have been wondering why, but it's my wife vacuums like probably every 4 or 5 days, and I'm like, what? You don't need to vacuum that much. And then anyway, so I mentioned to you, she's in the States for a couple of months. She's actually American, and I'm back here just with a dog. Anyway, my daughter borrowed the vacuum cleaner, and I was like, I need the vacuum cleaner back. I need to clean. My wife wrote, I hate to think how messy it was before I thought about vacuuming. So for me to say I need the vacuum, she's like, oh crap.
Must have been really bad.
2.5 weeks, I think it was. So.
Yes. But that's a perfect example of it takes up mental space, and then you throw in like all, it's just, I think it's a great point that people don't think about, like, why am I overwhelmed? Not necessarily because of all the work things, but then I worry about, you know, okay, we're still going back to school with COVID and my kids, plus all the home things. So it's all the little things that women put on themselves, or how we're wired, that it makes the job very different.
Yeah, thinking about their birthdays coming up, my wife would be like, oh, there's a sale on, so she'll be buying something in May for Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I don't want to be stereotyped, but talking for myself, I don't think like that. Okay. So yeah, the pandemic. So this is really pretty serious. You know, we're kind of joking around a bit, but you know, I saw that, you know, more males are actually publishing and less females are publishing during the pandemic. So that's just a disaster, right? They're already on the back foot. And, you know, this could be, you know, many years before, you know, assuming the pandemic actually ends and we go back to normal, you know, you're already on the back foot and it's going to be worse, right?
Well, yeah. And I mean, I think everyone was doing the best they could, but I know like here in the US and in my, you know, current academic position, we just carried along like everything was the same. Like you still, you know, like everything was virtual, but we still had all of the same to-dos and all of these expectations, and it wasn't, you know. And so I think I think even having this conversation, or how do we actually work together to help build that gap? And just one example on the reverse end of the publishing is the number of review requests I get per day from journals, multiple. Like, so I get at least 3 requests, at least 3 a day, at least 3 every other day, to review a paper. And as a woman, I'm thinking like, I'm a helper, like we're designed, we want to, I that. No, I shouldn't, because I need to write my own papers. So it's really this juggle of how do we bridge this gap, and recognizing that, yes, there is a gap and we're even further behind. How do we take, you know, have the conversation and help move that forward?
Okay, so we've talked about a few bits and pieces, a lot around the home and things, and you've talked about some of the pressures with work. What are some of the other things you've thought about?
Well, one thing that I would love to talk about that it's kind of this elephant in the room, I think, usually, is the appearance of women. And as a woman, it becomes such it's a way bigger impact on me than it would be on you. And nobody really recognizes, or they care not to. And just an example that I always think about is like when I started in the field, I was very young. Like many of my students were similar in age, and to be respected, I needed to look a certain way. Or in exercise physiology, like women have a much bigger standard to look a certain way. And one specific example I always give is every semester on teaching evaluations, I get comments about my clothing, whereas my male colleagues have never gotten that. It just is, again, not a huge stress, but one more thing I have to think about is how I present myself and what clothing do I wear. Not only like, it should be about my science, not about how I look.
Yeah, I mean, that's pervasive throughout. You're having to deal with that, but we have a classic, people probably don't know, but we had a prime minister here, which is like the president, but Julia Gillard. And she had all these comments all the time about, people aren't talking about the president or the prime minister, the male, about what they're wearing or whatever, but she even got this thing like, oh, she's a barren woman, which she had no kids, and then there was all this talk about her partner and, was he masculine enough or whatever. It was just ridiculous. So the things you wouldn't have to think about. So no one's commented about my dress, how I dress, or anything in my, what clothes I wear, but you've had that like consistently, like. Oh
yes, all the time. And even comments, they're not meant to be malicious, but comments about my body, or oh, you have opportunities based on the way you look. And then I think you brought up another really important point that takes, mental load for me, is how I act and how I write. So if I write an email and I don't have enough exclamation points, or it's written in a certain way, then I'm considered a bitch. But if a man was to write that, they would be considered a leader and a boss. Oh. And so there's a lot of mental load that goes into, especially as I progress in my career and I'm, higher on the rung, whatever that means, is, the way I say things and write things is taken. I have to be nice, and I can't be direct, because then I'm considered differently. Whereas as a male does they're a leader and they have good qualities. And so, nobody's talking about that. And I think it's a really important thing.
Yes, if you're ambitious and you want to do well and you want to move up to department head or dean or whatever, if you're a male, that's considered just, normal. Like if you're not, then what's wrong with you? But if you're a female, sometimes it's almost like, oh, you're a bit aggressive, or you're trying to get ahead of whatever. That there's this extra sort of layer of consideration, I guess. That's
you're trying too hard. Yeah, you're bossy. And I know for me, my time, it's very much, I wouldn't say changed me for who I am, but it has. I've had to be very introspective about my personality and how I present myself and how I, write my emails and interact with my male colleagues.
Yeah, no emails in all caps. That called me out once. I had no idea, because you know how you can have like an email and you want to respond just by, they say something and you write underneath. I did it in all caps, because just so it would stand out. And they were like, "What's the all caps, dude?" Like I was aggressive or something. But yeah. But
can you imagine if I did that?
You, right? You did that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so another thing that you actually mentioned, I saw written up somewhere as well, is the fact that females tend to do more service work in universities. That's also going to be cutting in. And I think you also touched on, you tend to want to be nice and say yes to things, so it probably overlaps, yeah.
Yeah, and I love service. That's, but I would also say that's partly because I'm a woman. Like, women are designed, not all women, but many women are designed. There's research to support that we're designed to help others. And so I think it's two things. A lot of times women are asked more to be in a service role to help others. And many of us have a hard time saying no. And, I think there's a big movement here, like just say no, but how do you say no to your boss, or picking which things you can say no to? And I think a specific example I have, and so like when I had children, I saw very much a downturn in invitations to give talks and to go do things academically. And I think people were the perception from most men in the field are like, oh, she's too busy, or she wouldn't want to now that she's had children. And so after children, I didn't feel that I could say no, because then those opportunities would not come back up. So it was almost saying like, you have to say yes so that people, that you can, if that's something that you want, you have to say yes so that you can work your way back up. And then, there are a lot of service things, and we want to help the students and the university and whatever it may be. And so I think it's a mix of how we're wired, but then also how many times are we being asked things.
Now, I'm glad to see that you were one of the ones that said yes to my podcast, because it's helping me balance my. So yeah, just thinking about, okay, so being a bit self-centered here, but with the podcast. So this is how I sort of started thinking about this. So then, I guess I'm trying to think, should I, or I don't know if should is the right word, not meant to say should. But now one option is I try and make it 50-50, 50 male, 50 female. But then, as we said, the people that are the sort of who's who in the area do tend to be more male, right? But I do want to sort of redress it a little bit. So, I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on that? I'm thinking maybe I should, if there's, it's kind of like the affirmative action thing, if it's too similar, and then if the female was just not slightly, less credentialed, I'm more than happy to go, with the female, because I want to sort of be part of the solution, not part of the problem. Makes sense.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind though is like, I never want an opportunity just because I'm a woman. Like I hope that you asked me based on my scientific credentials and not just because I'm a woman. Yeah. But then I think at the same time, I do think you're right. Like, if we just take the publishing and the funding, it is harder for women to juggle all of that along with everything else. And so, you are seeing more men. And so one thing would be to do is to say, well, how are you judging who's who? And, I think you're using criteria like an H index. But can you also look at, what are some key papers that have higher citations? Maybe they don't have as many, but they've had some really significant contributions to a specific area of science. Or like one thing that I think would be really interesting, like we're not talking about science yet here.
Right.
Yeah, we're not talking about science yet here, any of the work I've done, but just about my experience and women, what about a woman in an administrative position or that is at the top that maybe isn't doing as much research and their H index isn't as high, but they're having impacts in other ways. So maybe redefining that criteria.
Yeah, one thing I had thought about was also, at one stage someone said, oh, I've got some really good early career researchers that would be, fit the bill. And I was thinking like, oh, but I want to be who's who. I want to be the, the absolute. If you think of respiration during exercise, you think it's Jerry Dempsey. You're going to get Jerry Dempsey. But, that's a fair point, because especially as I mentioned earlier, that, the higher up you get, the less females there are. It's actually a way of trying to redress that a bit. Is if you have early career researchers that are doing really well, then, if they get sort of opportunities like this, I'm not saying this is that, this podcast is going to make their career. But, if they get opportunities with conferences and, getting on podcasts and whatever else, then that does give them a chance to get higher up, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think I kind of chuckled when you sent me the email about, why maybe more women weren't participating. And I think, to me, one of my core values is education and translation. And I feel like opportunities like this allow me to talk about science in a way that more people will hear it. But honestly, if you were to ask me in my younger career, I might think of why would I spend this time talking a podcast when I really need to be writing a paper to be in the who's who. And so I think it's also, just recognizing of where those values are, or, I had to make sure my kids were somewhere so that I did have the time to be able to do it. So it's really just that idea of shuffling. We're all very busy.
And it's always also multifactorial. One person's reason for wanting to come on and not coming on
Yep.
isn't necessarily the same. The one thing I was thinking was my little, N=1 sort of study here, looking at people going on the podcast, was not only am I having less people saying yes to it, but the ones that do say yes, they say, oh, I'm really busy. Can I do it in September, October, November, or whatever? So that's given me a feel that they are, my feeling, without even thinking about that much, was, to get to the point of being a who's who, you've got to be more busy as a female than a male. And that's just the way it comes across with my little study here, because
which is sad though, right? And I think I
loved
how you even brought it up earlier too, like busyness shouldn't be a badge of honor. We should be talking more about work-life balance. I don't think that exists, but like, yes, we're all busy, but it's also where you prioritize. Where do you want to spend your time? Like, should I be doing other things right now? Sure. But to me, I think this is a very important conversation. And my hope is that it will, the however many people listen, it may, get a little bit more insight to how we might do it better.
Oh, well, I'm hoping that, this has been an education for me, thinking about it. So the Twitter, even though I found the thing in Twitter a bit awkward, and it's like, hang on, I already had 3 people, and whatever, it was actually good because it made it more, brought it more front of mind to me, the importance of it, made me think about, what are the reasons more. And, having you on there now, hopefully, some males will watch this as well and, and to learn from it. Now, I know the pandemic has just thrown, a mess with everything. But I was going to say, do you think things are actually improving? But, before the pandemic, I guess with the pandemic, it's got worse. But do you think, in terms of women in science, I don't know the data, are things actually getting better? Like, pay gaps and amount of people that are in senior positions in universities and things, do you know?
It's a good question. I don't know. I mean, I think that we're at a really good time and that more conversations are being had about not only women, but our field is not diverse. Just our in general exercise physiology is mostly white individuals, and so I think that there's a lot more conversation. And I know here in the US, there's a push for trying to improve that. So I think the conversation is there, but I don't think we've made a lot of strides yet, but I think talking about it and recognition is the very first step.
Yes. All right. Now, I think this is a good time to start thinking about your research. And, and this has been definitely a change over the last, 10, 15 years or so, where, there's much more thought about having, females involved. And I have to say, as I said to you before we started, I just showed my male-centric thing so badly. So when we were talking about what we talk about, I assume you said you could talk about female exercise physiology, and me being like a knucklehead was thinking, oh, sex differences, right? Which is just, I'm happy enough to say that it's ridiculous. So, because then I started thinking about it. It was actually before I got your feedback, and I thought, hang on a minute. I'm thinking female physiology is comparing females to males, and that is just so wrong. Because, you don't think, if there's a study in males, you don't think, oh, they're doing that study in males so that they, there's a comparison to females. But if there's a study in females, I'm thinking, oh, well, I'm assuming they're doing that so they compare it to males, right? I mean, obvious things like, menarche and amenorrhea and, menopause or whatever, obviously not. But other things I would tend to think, I'm throwing myself under the bus here, but at least I'm
yeah.
I would tend to think you do a study in females and you're wondering what happens in the males, but you can just look at the females on their own, obviously. And that's, I think, what you've started to do. So maybe if you can elaborate on that more.
I mean, I think the male, female, like the sex differences are so important. And I know you mentioned you're going to talk to Dr. Sandra Hunter. Like I think there's some great foundational physiology research about where there's some of those differences, lie. I have this interest in this. I mean, really, why are we not including more women? Often it does, like it's really this thought of it. It does require more time and money and effort in science, in research, when actually doing research. But there's still, some things we're unsure of. And, now most of the time we're including just normal menstruating women, when we know that the majority of women are using some form of hormonal contraception. And so to me, it's more about reducing barriers to allow for a larger group of women to be in the science, like in the research, so we can understand what's happening, so that we can, answer more of those questions. And so looking at female physiology of really what's happening across the menstrual cycle, what's happening when you have someone that's using some form of hormonal contraception on these physiological outcomes, so that now maybe if, just one study we did, if we are trying to measure body composition, this is actually a funny, I had a study in women, we had some men too, and my reviewer's comment was, you cannot use the DEXA in women, it's not valid. And I said, wait a second, there's no data on that. So I'm going to do a study to understand, well, how does a female's physiology impact the validity of the DEXA? Because that's a common tool we all use. And so we looked to see, how do measurements change throughout a menstrual cycle with the DEXA? And turns out they don't. So DEXA is a very valid, non-sensitive, or it's not.
No sense,
right?
Whatsoever. So if you had some other piece of equipment that you said, oh, this equipment does not work in 50% of the population, then that would be the end of the equipment. You can't just say that this doesn't work in women. I mean,
right. And well, what's the rationale behind it? But like reviewers have a lot of power. So but to me, it was also like, well, why don't we have that data? Like, if this is a common method that we're measuring with, we better know that.
Yeah. So one thing is, talk about early on, I was saying females are on the back foot, or women are on the back foot from the start, is, textbooks. Textbooks all assume, 70 kilogram male, and I've even noticed that when I've been doing pracs, we have quite a lot of Asian students here in Melbourne, and they'll tend to be shorter, even the males. And you say, well, hang on a minute, that doesn't fit them. But, you've got the females, that's just from the start. The assumption is that you have the male as the reference point, 70 kilogram male, and then you go from there. And, one thing I was saying is, we have this thing where we say, oh, it's a bit too hard, the female studies, because, you've got to control for the menstrual cycle. And then, as you said, if you're on hormonal contraceptives and premenopausal, postmenopausal, or whatever. But as I was saying to you before we started, I've done quite a lot of studies in rodents, so mice and rats, and we never go, oh, hang on a minute, what stage of their menstrual cycle are the rats and mice? And we don't even worry. Quite often you'll just do them, like if you'll do run one on a treadmill and then look at it and then do another one, and it's not even the same time of day. But with females now, we're saying, oh, it's well, I mean, it is complicated, right? That's the trouble. It is complicated, but I guess what do we do about it? Because I mean, I know I'm sort of all over the place, but you go, okay, you can do a male, and that's pretty much steady. And the female, you're going to say, okay, are they premenopausal, postmenopausal, contraceptives, what stage of the menstrual cycle? To do a study properly, you should have probably 7 groups or something, yeah?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of things we can do. So one thing that I think is great, so Dr. Kirstie Elliott-Sale and her group, they published this great paper about methodology. What are some key methodology that you want to do to help, to characterize your sample, which I think is great. But in reality, if we're in the lab trying to do a human-based study, you're right. I don't have all the time and the resources for every study to do all these things. And so part of my aim is let's help understand what are the key things that we do in different, every study has different levels of funding. And to me, it's really about let's characterize and understand what are the most important with the least amount of resources, so that we can start to include more women in all these studies where it's not this huge hurdle. So reducing the barriers to allow us to, okay, at bare minimum, have them track their cycle in a free app and talk about that. And so it's really more as we are reviewing papers and writing papers, let's describe the sample. So one thing, actually, I'll send out, my group has survey that we used, a questionnaire that asked key questions about menstrual cycle and a number of these characteristics that you could just simply do a free questionnaire. And then when you're writing the paper, just characterize your sample a little bit more so we understand where they're at, even if you can't control for it all. Yeah. And then I think the other thing that nobody's talking about is the funding. Like, we need more funding that's specifically supporting trying to include more of these female subjects. It costs a little bit more, nothing crazy, but pregnancy tests and ovulation sticks and measures of estrogen and progesterone. And I think there's a lot of traction right now, but what I've seen is there's no money to follow. Like, there does need to be a little bit more support right now so that we can understand what are the key things that we do need to actually implement. And so to me, that's where when I say female physiology, let's do understand, for example, we know a lot about blood flow and that differs between males and females, and even hydration across the menstrual cycle. So a lot of the times is let's just measure them when they're menstruating. And that gives you a very low hormone phase, nothing like, when they're bleeding and when they're not. So it just allows a concrete time point of when to measure them, and it doesn't cost a lot. So just trying to help reduce some of those barriers.
So when you do these studies, if you choose a particular phase, then you do the study. Is part of the problem that you can't assume what you get will be the same in the other phases? That's probably true, right?
Yeah, I mean, with hormonal fluctuations, depending on the outcome, yes, it could be different if I measure them at different phases of the cycle and I don't account for it. So it could be, let's say I'm doing an interval training intervention or a nutrition intervention, and I'm not accounting for those changes, it may be coming from the cycle, hormonal fluctuations, and not the intervention itself.
Yes, just say you want to look at, I don't know, stuff I've done before. So like carbohydrate ingestion effects on performance, or glycogen resynthesis after exercise or something. You would naturally only be able to apply those results you got to that phase that you looked at. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think carbohydrate metabolism is the thing we know differs the most fat metabolism, but with exercise in females. Yeah. And so, I mean, I'm a pragmatist. Like, you can't change exercise, and nor would you change it in whatever cycle. But understanding, like, we know carbohydrate metabolism differs in the high hormone phase. And so understanding, like, if you really want to look at muscle glycogen repletion in a woman, you absolutely would want to know what phase of the cycle or what type of contraception they're using so that you can understand how it might change.
Yeah, but then if you got, just say if you found glycogen resynthesis was, again, I'm thinking about sex differences. So yeah, if you're looking at saying, okay, glycogen resynthesis was faster in the females than the males, then you'd have to say, okay, but that was during the follicular phase. You'd have to then, someone else would have to look at another phase or whatever, right? You can't. Yeah,
and I mean, I think we have some of that data, but I think it helps to understand, though I see it like maybe one step previously would be, do we need different amounts or different doses or types of carbohydrate in a female than a male? Just bigger picture. Right now, all of our nutrition and exercise recommendations are the same for females that they are for males. And to me, that's crazy. Like, maybe they are the same, and but we should at least understand that before,
Yeah. I think it's clear that I'm not an expert on this, but every time pretty much I see a talk or read something that hasn't compared males and females, the sex differences, it's almost always there's something different, more often than not.
Right, that it hasn't trickled down to, like, even, as I go to start my new semester and teach exercise physiology, there's one sex-based difference chapter, but really all of the foundational information, that's not intertwined as we talk about, cardiac output and muscle fiber differences and stuff, or how they adapt. And so I think it's really just, why hasn't it trickled down? We know there are differences, but we're still basing all of our baseline physiology on males.
Yeah. Just thinking about grant funding we talked about earlier, for a while there, our grant funding, our sort of NIH equivalent, but it's much smaller, the NH and MRC here, you would have a question that would say, are you using males and females? Yeah. I don't know if you have something similar. And if you just were using, but the assumption again was it males or was it males and females? It was, I didn't even think it was a box for just females. I could be wrong. But the thing people would say was, doing males as a proof of concept, you know, especially if it's something new, you know, if we find an effect of this on that, or, you know, this drug or the training or whatever, then we'll go on and look at females. I think that it got to the point, you know, thankfully, that you couldn't actually do that anymore. That was not considered enough, because, you know, why couldn't you make the argument, oh, we'll look at the females, and if it's different, we'll go and look at the males. You know, that doesn't tend to be the way people think. How's it going now with NIH? How does that sort of go? Are you expected to look at males and females generally?
I mean, we have a similar checkbox of are you including women? And I think it's great. And I think there's a bigger expectation of including males and females. But I have a funny story. So I look at a lot of kind of pre to perimenopausal women, kind of what's happening in the perimenopause. And I had an NIH grant that was submitted. And my feedback was, how are you going to recruit these women, these perimenopause? They're not going to participate. They're hard to find. And so I got a ding on that piece, even though we measure them all the time. You would never say that about a male participant. How are you going to recruit them? Like, you do it. And I think I got another comment actually from my IRB, which was very fascinating. And they said, one of you need to put in there that childcare is a detriment or a cost of participation for these women. And I said, you would never say that to a male. Like, why would childcare be a participation, like a, you know? And so just, I think this conversation about, it's there, people recognize we need more women, but there's more barriers that our people are placing as we, you know, try to include women as research subjects.
Yeah. Just thinking more about some of your research, I saw you've got some reviews on nutritional strategies for females or for women. Is there anything, you know, that you want to sort of bring out here that is sort of quite different between women and men with their nutritional needs?
I think
with exercise.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, this is a good question. And it really stems from, I don't know if you've seen this debate, but in this realm, there's this big debate about whether I need to change my nutrition and training across the menstrual cycle. I don't think that we do. It's more about recognizing some of these changes. And with nutrition specifically, you know, I think we definitely need more data, but there are some key things. And, you know, I look at a lot of dietary supplements that could be advantageous for women that maybe they're not taking or they're not considering because it's all based on male data or it's very male centric. And so, I mean, one thing that I've studied specifically is something like creatine supplementation, where, you know, all the foundational research is in males. You know, the goal was to increase performance, but now we're seeing a lot more interesting data that creatine can also impact the brain and impact as women become pregnant and postpartum recovery. We have a study that's in review looking at the impact of creatine on hydration across the menstrual cycle. So we know that changes in creatine can actually potentially help with fluid retention and hydration, particularly in the luteal phase. So it might be even more important. So some of those things I think are fascinating, and some small tweaks that can be important for females.
Yeah, so again, I think, when I asked that question, did I ask compared to males again? Because I think I'm just stuck on that. Did I? I hope not.
No, I don't think so.
Oh, that's good, because I think it's just so clear. I mean, if I've learned anything from our interactions here, or one of the things I learned is to stop thinking of female and, you know, looking at women and exercise as how does it compare to males? Because obviously, if you're talking about across the menstrual cycle or perimenopause or whatever, there's no comparison to that. Just forget that. We're just wanting to understand what's happening in the female for its own sake, which makes, I can't believe I just sound like such an old fogey. I did just turn 60, so maybe that's my
No, I think it's how we're ingrained. But I love that we're having the conversation because it to me, maybe it's not different than a male, and that's fine, but we still need to understand, well, how does it affect a female? And, to me, we have very little data on perimenopausal women itself. And frankly, I don't really care how it compares to a male of someone the same age, because the physiology of the woman is so very different. I want to know, how do we help her improve, her health and quality of life based on physiology and nutrition, because we don't know, and it's 2022. And so I think it's just trying to recognize of how do we target that. And maybe it's not different. Maybe my recommendations are the exact same, but the fact that I'm speaking to her physiology is something that we're not doing.
So if everything was actually the same, you could say, okay, so now we'll just go back and we'll just look at women, that's all, right? But people tend to go, if everything was exactly the same in the male and the woman, then you'd say, okay, well, we don't have to do the woman anymore, we'll just do the males. But if you could make the same argument, you just, okay, we'll just do women from now on.
Or maybe they are the same. Okay, well, then now great. Now I have twice the subject, population. Now I can just include them all. Yeah.
Doubled your pool. Exactly.
Yeah. And that, to me, a lot of the things that we're doing too is trying to understand that we are looking at a lot of different types of contraception in comparison to eumenoric women, because finding women that are eumenoric, not taking a contraception, that have no health contraindications, is finding a unicorn. And so, it's hard to find those people. When reality, do we need to? If you're taking a monophasic birth control, it matches a similar, or what about an IUD that's more localized hormone? So we're trying to dial some of that in on some of these outcomes, so that then when we go do a larger study, okay, now you don't need to just include eumenoric, you can include some of these contraceptive methods, so you have a much bigger sample pool, and we know it won't necessarily negatively impact that physiological outcome that we're trying to measure.
Okay, so just out of interest, with the IUD, that there's such a small amount of hormone, does that actually even get sort of systemic and change sort of physiology? Do we know? Or
as far as I know, it does not. The tricky part that we see with IUDs is that many women don't menstruate. They don't actually bleed, but they still ovulate. So if we're trying to understand what's happening for this baseline research, is when do we test them? And so no, like that would, to me, the biggest case would be including eumenoric and IUD users, and that would be a good sample pool. But the interesting thing, at least in the US, is that most women that have an IUD happens post children. So now you're in a different age group, whereas more of an oral contraceptive is used in a younger group. So it's trying to understand some of that, so that we can say, okay, here's our criteria, let's include these women.
Okay. And I know you've done a lot of work with body composition. So you spoke before about DEXA. Is there anything sort of interesting you want to sort of, get out that you've been finding with your body composition measures? So you
Yeah. So, I mean, I think one takeaway that we kind of already mentioned is that DEXA, it's not the most valid method for composition, but a lot of people think it's the gold standard. It's very not, but it is not sensitive to things like menstrual cycle changes. So it's a very good method to use if you are tracking women, meaning that it won't be impacted by kind of these physiological changes. If you use any method of water, so whether that's deuterium or bilateral impedance, which tends to improve the accuracy of DEXA. So we tend to use a modified 4-compartment model with DEXA plus a water measure, so that we understand what's happening. But that water measure becomes very sensitive across the menstrual cycle. So for example, even kind of follicular, like menstruating versus late follicular, which is around, right before ovulation. So day, 7 to 13, there's fluid changes there that impact body composition. And so, as a researcher, I know, let's say I'm trying to understand the impacts of fluid distribution or some aspect of body composition, say from an intervention I'm going to want to make sure that I measure them early follicular at this kind of around the same window. So days 0 to 7, to understand what's actually happening from the intervention and not something that's menstrual cycle or hormone related.
Okay, well, thanks a lot. It's been really interesting. I've learned a lot about women in science and also about your research. So thanks a lot for coming along.
Glenn, I just want to thank you for actually having this conversation and for allowing me to be a part of it. So thanks.
Okay, good. Bye-bye.